It's a very unfairly generous way to set this up. um, well, I really appreciate it. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person. Very narrowly, I was looking at a lot of different ways to try to make it work because God, if nothing else, I just miss traveling. But I'm not an ultra homebody type who thrives on sort of sticking to my chair at my desk all the time. And I really love that I've been lucky to travel a lot, not least of which has led me to meeting you, Gabby, and which of course also led to meeting Ingville and the sort of broader ecosystem of folks on that side. It's been a real pleasure, and it's been one of the things that's been hardest to cope with outside the norm of just everything else to deal with the pandemic. So yes, anyway, I'm sorry I couldn't make it. It's sad because this particular event has been one of these things that we've tried to make work like 50,000 times now. I think that I was invited to Konsoll first in like 1961, and we've tried every year since then. So yeah, as was mentioned, I'm basically just here to kind of chat about, I suppose, how it is that I work, and then my hope is to really just open it for questions as early as possible, so that we can kind of take the conversation in hopefully interesting places. But I did, since this is obviously not the way that I would normally be doing it, where if I was there, I could be on stage, presumably giving some type or semblance of a presentation. Instead, I figured I would just walk you through how it is that I typically work, since I'm in my space. So the long and short of it is, obviously when scoring a game, one of the most cliche questions that I am asked frequently, because I work in film a fair bit as well, is what is fundamentally the difference between the two? And working in games as a composer is actually quite distinct from film, even though at the end of the day they share in common this salient characteristic of storytelling, and of the idea that music is there to support a larger framework in general. There are exceptions, but my job is essentially to talk with a game designer and a team at large and say, how can we use music to further what you're trying to do? And that can manifest a lot of different ways, because, and this is one of the things that I love, especially about games, there's no prescribed set type of game. Films from a mechanics standpoint are all obviously pretty consistent with one another. Your film starts here, it ends here. There's not a hell of a lot of variation that's going to emerge out of that. Whereas games, and just even the manner with which we play them, can vary so widely that even just the process of how I do my job can vary widely. So yeah, I just thought it would be fun to kind of talk through some specific examples of games that I've worked on, and just how we kind of stepped through them. And then with that, I'm happy to just shift to having a dialogue and answering your questions. I also said I would happily kind of show you around my space here, which is, it's not a huge amount to see, but it's something. I realized, of course, after I made that offer, that my camera is of course tethered to my computer. And so what I will have to do is use my phone to join separately the Zoom call here, and then I can wander around and I can show you my space. But yeah, before I well, actually, you know what? Let me start with that, because I'm going to go down a rabbit hole talking process. So hopefully this doesn't totally break everything.
Come on, revert. There we go. There we can see yourselves. Amazing. Oh, look at that. Look at all the wavingness. And you see my very fancy setup of the camera on the keyboard, as I always do every time I do my podcast. yeah, you can see here is my setup. It's actually reasonably simple. Basically, just a lot of gear, a lot of retired gear. I have 1, 2, 3 computers I don't use anymore and that are not even plugged into anything. This is my current machine, which is all gutted and ripped out of its travel case. And then a little hidden away Alienware that I use for playing builds and stuff. So, and the funny thing is that this wasn't originally designed as it wasn't originally, the piano was up against that wall, but during the pandemic, because, I've got like a couch there where I have meetings and things. And, but then when the world shut down and I stopped having meetings, I realized, well, it'd be kind of nice to have the piano somewhere in reach where I could just turn around and play it. And so I never put it back. So I kind of immediately, closed off this space to sort of normal use. And one of the things that, if you look around, it's very gray in here by design, because I am all about sort of my very artsy, pretentious description is that it's all about the music being the sort of primary source of color in the room. I don't like if the room feels like it's biasing me in a certain favor. The other thing is that I also don't really keep reminders of past work in here. Like, for example, if I go into the front room, which is mostly storage at this point, like this is where, I will have these posters and things. And it's where I keep these distractions, because they are, this to me is very antithetical to creating new work. And obviously, I'm very grateful that that my career has been as generous to me as it has. But none of this stuff, this is all stuff that I happily keep in a different room. So it's, probably the most exciting is like I got a nice Star Wars pinball machine right here that's old but still works, and is very exciting. And the obligatory 1983 B-wing hanging from the ceiling, which only sometimes leaks from the rain. And a bunch of painting. This is actually my girlfriend Angela. This is a painting she made, as a side note, while we were recording the Banner Saga. She was in the room with the orchestra and that, which I always loved. She also painted this, which for anybody who's played the Banner Saga would recognize that image. But anyway, I started to say there's no reminders of past projects by design. The one sort of exception is that I have been given a few gifts along the way that I kept in here because they're all about the people who gave them to me. And, this was from the folks at Ready at Dawn on the Order. This was also from, actually, Angela made this, but as a reminder of this little game that we did called Deformers. This wonderful singer from Maluka gave me this after we did the Banner Saga. Got some little crocheted Jacob and Evie, and a separate Evie that the actress Victoria, who plays Evie, signed for me, which is very nice. Little things like that. A little John Wick Continental coin from Mike Bissell. Those kinds of things. Back there is just the storage. Although, because Troy is always over here, there is an obligatory one of these. All right, enough of that. I'm shutting this one down.
All right, I had the rest muted, so I'm just assuming I wasn't wandering around talking to myself for the last 3 minutes, right? That was visible to you guys. Okay, good. Strangely, not all of you gave me a thumbs up, so it's possible that somehow only some of you could see. Anyway, you can see I record a fair bit in here, and I can write and mix, although I certainly spend, from a production standpoint, I spend a lot of my time going outside to record musicians in their spaces, or obviously if it's an orchestra or something like that, we have to go to a wide variety of different types of studios and different mixing environments. So I do primarily think of this as a writing space. It's a creative space where the goal is to create. It is not a goal, it is not a production facility, you know, where the goal is to finely tune all the aspects of the mix and all of that, even though I do often do a lot of that here. This isn't meant to feel like a recording studio. It's meant to feel, you know, a little bit more like it's like the attic of a crazy person. That's a little bit more, I think, accurate to my process and that sort of thing. So I thought I could just talk about a few different types of things that I've worked on and give a rundown on how we work. So, you know, I'll happily start with, you know, the title that you're almost certainly most familiar with, which is that game company's Journey, which crazy enough, we're only a few months away from the 10th anniversary of the release of that game, which is really difficult for my brain to wrap its head around, because it's sort of one of those odd things where it feels like it's somehow farther ago and it's yesterday. Another baffling trivia that occurred to me yesterday was that by the time Journey comes out and we hit that 10th anniversary, 20% of the time between that day and when it came out, 20% of that 10 years will have been spent in the pandemic, which is also a very baffling thought. So the way that one worked, and you know, I've given whole hour-long breakdowns of Journey, so forgive that this is going to be a little bit superficial, but I'm not obviously quite sure. Actually, out of curiosity, since I can see a good chunk of you guys, out of curiosity, who would call themselves a game developer sort of first and foremost? And no matter which sort of field or discipline within that, but I'm just curious sort of, you know, to what extent I'm talking to a group of developers. It seems like, you know, I don't know, maybe half, maybe not quite half. Does that mean that the rest are maybe, are there composers en masse in the group? What do we have in terms of musicians or composers? Are we, is there any representation of the few, the proud of my brethren here in the crowd? Oh, good. Well, that's a good position to be in. It's not often that a composer finds themselves in a room surrounded by people that potentially need music. So that's good. I hope those of you in the room who just now raised your hand, don't squander this magnificent opportunity. Well, okay. Since I can't hear you at the moment, I don't have the ability to sort of ask where the rest of you fall. So you'll just give me a sense of that when we shift to Q&A. And so also, folks backstage, can you remind me, are we good until what would be my 8:30, like 40 more minutes from now? I just want to make sure I'm not about to bump up against a hard out and then miss the chance to actually have these Q&A. Okay, cool. Super blurry thumbs up in the foreground. Love it. Okay, so Journey, the way that worked is, first off, the game started development right after Flower shipped, which was in early 2009. And the game took a full 3 years of development to finally ship. And I was very fortunate to be there every single part of that, every day of development. In fact, not just that, but I was essentially the first person to actually start creating content for the game, because Genova Chen, the creative director, and Matt Nava, who was the art director at the time, you know, part of how they like to work in particular, but it really was true of TGC in general, was that rather than the typical sort of dependency, you could even argue, on concept art as a way to focus the team and to create a kind of visual benchmark that everyone's aspiring to and that sort of thing, they would use music. Genova's whole philosophy, at least at the time, I think this still holds true with a lot of things of what he did on Sky, although I didn't work on Sky, so I'm not entirely sure if this is accurate, but it's always been the case, even back when we worked on Flow, which was almost like 15 years ago. Genova's attitude was, more than anything else, the goal is to create a feeling, a purely kind of emotional takeaway for the player. He's not looking for an intellectual takeaway. He's not, obviously his games don't rely on things like high scores and extra lives or any of these kinds of more conventional gamey constructs or mechanics. And so the emotional takeaway is all that matters. So his philosophy was, if I can discover a piece of music, or if I can collaborate with a composer to create a piece of music that evokes a very specific feeling in me, and that's the feeling I want the player to take away from playing the game, then having that piece of music as kind of like, it's almost like a pin that you can put on a mood board and say, every decision I make about the game design is going to either move me closer to or farther away from the emotion of that piece of music. And so that it becomes the North Star in the sky. And so by having it early, the primary direction to the team can essentially be, well, gut check your work. Does it make you feel the way this makes you feel? And if not, then, course correct. And one of the things that's sort of implicit in that I like is, by deciding on a piece of music, everyone is actually going to have a slightly different reaction to it and relationship to it. And it becomes a little bit of this embrace of that subjectivity, where it's not, I want you guys to make a game that feels the way this piece of music makes me feel, but it's more like, make your work reflective of how this piece makes you feel. So the game ends up being a slightly heterodoxical in the way that the team contributes emotionally to it, which is really cool. I think that's what helps make their games feel sort of universal in a way, because it's not so single-mindedly obsessed with a single point of view. Like TGC doesn't prop up Genova as a Kojima-esque auteur where everything in the game is about adhering to his sole vision. It's more communal. The team, in fact, if you look at the end credits on Journey, for example, they don't even put people's titles. They just alphabetically list everybody on the team, so that you have a production assistant being listed side by side with the executive producer, because they were both just that game company. That's all that mattered. So the way we started was, he basically, knowing all of that about their process, he basically described to me what the aspirations of the game were, philosophically and emotionally. And he just, we talked about Joseph Campbell and the Hero of a Thousand Faces, and the sort of archetypes of the so-called monomyth. And if you're not familiar with that and the way that undergirds everything about Journey, then you've got reading to do. Actually, funny enough, I've been rereading this book because it's been a long time since I read it. I couldn't, where's my camera? I couldn't recommend it more highly. This is the foundation of everything, basically. I mean, it's just, if you're not familiar with Joseph Campbell, you from now you are. And so go forward and read this book, or read about him in this book. It's truly fascinating and insightful about humanity. So we talked all about that kind of stuff. And then Genova said, well, can you write a theme for us to kind of start this process, some kind of emotional summary of what we're going for. And I remember I walked to my car and I left myself a voicemail, because it just sort of hit me. It's usually far more of an iterative process where I try things and I refine and I throw out many ideas. But this was a rare one where I literally left myself a voicemail where I sort of sang I said, okay, it's going to start with the solo cello, ba 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 ba. Then we have a flute come in, bass flute specifically, that can play, like, they can play in the range beyond that of a typical C flute, and then lush strings come in, and then that's all well and good. And I remember I called my cellist, this fabulous musician, Tina Guo, and I said, can you meet me at the studio in an hour or whatever? And she came over and recorded it. And I later called that piece Nascence. It was called like Journey Theme version 1 or whatever. It was the file for the next 3 years. But later called it Nascence. And if you listen to the soundtrack album, or if you, it's funny enough, it's not actually in game anywhere. It lived on the PS3 on the cross media bar. They don't really do that anymore. So I think the only way to hear that piece now, is, ironically, is actually on the soundtrack album. But it's the first piece, and we recorded it that day, other than the string orchestra, which was recorded at the very end of the process, literally almost 3 years later at the end of 2011. In fact, just the other day, thanks to Facebook, I saw a little reminder that it was like November 11 or something, just literally a few days ago. I tweeted out that day was the exact 10th anniversary of when we recorded the orchestra for Journey, which was a wild memory to think of, because it there was nothing to prepare me for the kind of firestorm of a response to the game. I really remember at the time just thinking, oh, thank God we got through all the music in time and we didn't go over budget, and the orchestra played really nicely. I took a chance on a totally unproven group of musicians who had cold called me, that are based in Skopje, Macedonia, and they had reached out saying, they were looking for recording clients, and we were originally set to record all the orchestral elements for Journey in California. And then for a bunch of political reasons, I don't need to drag you through that, ended up becoming a non-option. And so it's like, okay, we'll need to find somewhere else to record. And we didn't have the budget to do, Abbey Road with the London Symphony. And so it's like, okay, well, there are other options in the world. And I wonder, there's a few standard ones. And then this French entrepreneur named Laurent, who had started an orchestra in Skopje, just cold called me. I have no idea how he found my information or anything. He just emailed and said, could we maybe talk to you about a recording project? So I remember I went to Sony and I said, I have an idea of where to record. And of course, they're like Googling, where is Macedonia? Because, they're Americans and none of us know anything about geography. And we went there and they played fabulously. And it started a long partnership. And I've worked with them on a million games of mine since then, including the Bergen homegrown title of Pod, which also featured Tina Guo as well, and even recently the Pathless with Giant Squid, which came out exactly a year ago, which is an offshoot off of Journey. Matt started his own company and made Abzû after Journey came out, and we did that together, and then now the Pathless, and it's the same group of musicians that we've worked with, and they've been a magnificent partnership. So recording them at the very end with these cello solos that had been recorded almost 3 years prior was a sort of surreal moment of realizing we really are in the 21st century now, that I can mix a recording where certain elements of it are recorded quite literally years apart from each other, and it still works as if they're playing as an ensemble by some kind of magic. So I guess the question is sort of, what was the process in between that very first day of just writing a track, which is a term I never use. People always say, how long does it take you to write a track or something like that? I don't write tracks. That's really, a track is what you listen to on Spotify. And in video game music, that's really, generally speaking, not what we do, at least not what I do. Because for me, it's a question of how does the music behave in game? And that was absolutely the pursuit with Journey, to find a way to organically sort of drip down into the cracks of the gameplay so deeply that the music feels like it's essentially just an extension of the visuals and of the mechanics and of the feedback you get from your controller and all of that. And so the question is, how to do that. And to be honest, I don't even know, because every single time it's different. And every time you start a new project, first off, it's new people you're collaborating with. So there's new personalities, there's new ideas, there's new tastes. There's also new goals. Games are meant to feel differently. Like the most recent game that I worked on that just came out a couple months ago is from a studio called Cold Iron, which was an Aliens, this online squad shooter called Aliens Fireteam Elite, sort of a Left 4 Dead style game in the Aliens, Ridley Scott Alien franchise. And, the emotional goals, needless to say, of a game like that are quite distinct from a game like Journey. There's little to no overlap other than the philosophical sense of how do we make it feel like it's just interwoven with the player's experience. So in the case of a game like Journey, the way that we worked, because that game company's process is so unusual, my process ended up being very unusual, where what we would do, they would start creating these very rough prototypes of a given area of the game. For convenience sake, we called them levels, but obviously if you've played the game, it's a little weird to call it like level 1, level 2, level 3, but for technical purposes, it effectively was. The game essentially exists in 8 levels, 8 stages, separated by short little cutscenes, and it actually does have to like load and unload assets as you shift to those new areas, though it does so pretty seamlessly. And so what that meant is, okay, we're in this little section of the game, and what is the point? What are we doing here? And each one of them has its own kind of vibe. So if you take the third area of the game, for example, what we refer to as the desert, which is sort of the area of the game that you see on the posters. It's the most wide vista. The mountain is in clear view. The sky is kind of a green color, which was a very significant, conscientious choice from Matt. He really wanted that blue sky at the finale of the game to feel like something that you earned, you haven't seen before. So the sky is noticeably green in this earlier part of the game. There's clouds, there's the sort of meteors flying overhead, and it almost feels like it's an open world game. It's not technically, it's really just a giant hallway, but the walls are quite far to each side. So it creates this impression of being in a sense, a literal sandbox. And I remember Genova said, okay, every stage of this game is effectively metaphorically a chapter of a person's, sort of an average lifespan. So if it starts off with, reflections on birth and adolescence, and later kind of migrates into wisdom and old age, and even maybe something bordering on cynicism, and then the transcendence beyond. This portion should feel like teenage youthfulness, where everything is fine and there's no sense of danger, and you have this kind of hubris of, I can do literally anything, nothing could ever hurt me. So there should be a playfulness to it and a real carefree attitude. And this is where you first interact with the little creatures. It's a shame I don't have a good camera angle to show you the on my wall. I can't really see it. I have one of those little things that was made by Robin Hunicke while we were working on the game. Hold on, I'm gonna leverage my camera's awkward zoom. You can just barely see the tail of this thing hanging on my shelf, of the little creatures that fly around with you on Journey. Sitting on top of my shelf there's also a Journey scarf that was handmade by Robin as gifts for the team at the final Christmas party before the game shipped. Like I said, I only keep things that I associate with people. I don't like to keep reminders of the work, but that was a special memory. And so anyway, the little thing that swims around and interacts with you is sort of dolphin-esque, little, like, it's all about fun. It's all about charm. And so what I would do is I would just write a piece of music that to me feels approximately like that. And then we would just slug it into the game in a very awkward, just blunt way, as like, here's a 2-minute loop that it just plays. There's no interactivity whatsoever. And then what I would do is I would play test the game with that in there over and over and over and over. And I would just see the way that it feels as I move around different parts of the region. And occasionally little happy accidents would happen where, I would write the music to do some kind of little sort of, like, let's say it's doing this, like that's got this little dancing quality to it. And maybe when I do this, like little uplifting part, I happen to walk up to some little thing that interacts with me, and the two correspond. And I remember, ooh, that felt really good. I liked the way that the music seemingly enhanced this interaction that I had in this moment. I'm going to make a note of that. And I would make note of all these little accidents that would happen. And also I would make note of when it worked as a just kind of free form expression that was looping, oblivious to my gameplay. And I try to internalize all that. And then I would start to rip the music apart and sort of deconstruct it and say, okay, for those moments that felt really special and really crucial, how can I make sure that the player will, like, must have that happen? How do I make it so that every time I walk up to this little thing, the music can do that by design? And so then we would start, of course, have to talk to the programmers and say, okay, we have to find a way to make the game communicate to the audio this is a significant event. And so there's a whole process there of kind of troubleshooting the programming side of it. And then finally we say, okay, the system knows I'm walking into this region. We want the music to, make this statement. But then you realize, oh, well, if the music is just kind of looping along and then we interrupt it with this new musical statement, it actually doesn't feel like music anymore. It feels like you're hitting random shuffle in your Spotify playlist or something. That doesn't work either. So then you have to back step off of that and say, how do I prepare these transitions? How do I make it so that it feels like, if you've ever seen, a jazz combo that are playing together where they kind of make eye contact and then they move together like a flock of birds, where they just psychically seem to know what to do and where to go. The music and the gameplay had to have that similar kind of relationship, which meant we had to make educated guesses about what the player was going to be doing at any given time. And so it became about just, creating, if you remember sort of the old days of the internet, or if you're on a really slow connection and you load like a JPEG, you get this really pixelated, crappy version, and then it kind of sweeps downward and doubles the resolution, and now you can sort of see a little bit closer what it is, and then it sweeps through again and increases the resolution yet again, and it sort of increasingly comes into focus with each subsequent pass. That's effectively what we were doing with the score. Let's start with something really broad and really clunky and put it in there and just see how it feels. And then, we'll refine it, improve it a little bit. And then it's a little bit closer. We start breaking it apart. We add interactions to it. And we just, and always through the whole process, play testing it, figuring out how do we feel when we actually experience this. It can't be hypothetical or theoretical. It must be something that our experience of playing the game is validating. And of course, the best of all is to put it in the hands of somebody that doesn't know what it is and just say, play this, and then ask them, how do you feel? And you do that a bunch of times. And the first many times they're like, well, I'm confused. Like, is this a platformer or what am I doing? Like, and there's a lot of forcing your way through the uncertainty that comes from all of that, and realizing, this is not emotionally communicating. But over time, you make changes, you kind of iterate gradually. And hopefully what's being taken away from what I'm saying right now is that this is not a lightning bolt, look at us, we're a bunch of geniuses. Not at all. That game company worked so hard and so long. This game took twice as long as it was supposed to. Sony had greenlit, I think, a smaller team and a 1.5-year development cycle, and the team was larger, and it took 3 years than expectations by the time it shipped. And there's a lot of, if you go look up Genova Chen's talks on the subject, like from GDC and such, you'll see that was itself quite a source of drama. That game company almost didn't survive that as a result, but fortunately they did. And it was also a lot of hard work for me. At no point did I feel like I was being struck with some divine insight. At best, I felt like I was lucky that I was, able to work on something that gave me a lot of good ideas. But I also threw out huge amounts of material. I constantly just tossed music in the trash because it wasn't working. It is not, lest any of you fall for the mythology that a game that turned out well must have somehow been the result of some kind of divine providence on behalf of the developers. It's just simply never that way. If anything, you don't even know if it's good until you hit the button to make it go live on Steam or whatever, and then people like it and you go, oh, well, look at that. Isn't that a relief? I definitely felt that way with Journey. I remember the night before the review embargoes were going to drop, I just remember thinking to myself, well, look, I don't know if anyone else is going to like this game. I do feel like we managed to kind of say what we wanted to say as artists, but what I don't know is if what we had to say has any value, or if anyone else in the world will actually care about what we have to say. I just know that it feels very personally reflective of our goal, and if the rest of the world likes it, then that's going to just be bonus. And it was not, I had no hunch at all that the reviews were going to start coming in as positively as they did. And that even more important than that by far was that the players were going to respond as well as they did. And it's wild because still to this day, I mean, literally, essentially 7 days a week, people will message or write tweets or send emails or things to talk about the game, even as we approach the 10th anniversary of its release. The fact that it still somehow matters to people is something that I never stops feeling surreal to me. But for me, all that effort on it, by far the best part of which was that it yielded some really genuinely meaningful relationships in my life. It has spun off almost everything in my life that matters to me. I mean, obviously, not least of which, contextual to talking to you folks, the fact that I was able to go to the UK courtesy of Gabby and Sadish, who invited me to their festival, which is where I met Ingvill, which is why I was able to work on Pod, which is a game I absolutely adore and cherish the privilege of having worked on. I even got to visit Bergen because Genova got married. In fact, he got married the day that Abzû came out, because Abzû was a separate company. It was a spin-off, Giant Squid, started by the art director from Flower and Journey, Matt Nava. And I remember Genova got married in Norway, and actually, I guess he got married the day before, because then I took the train to Bergen before I flew home, and I was literally wandering around Bergen reading the reviews of Abzû, just hoping that people liked the game. It was the same exact experience, but I was in this absolutely beautiful city on that day in August of 2016, and it was awesome. And like all of that for me is an offshoot. That's the thing I absolutely I cherish so much about this career, and it's something I always try to impart to people when I'm given the opportunity to speak to crowds like this, is that, obviously we're very, very lucky to be able to make games and to be able to work in a creative field and engage this side of our brain, and not just have to be cold and calculating and analytic in everything that we do, but we get to sort of feel our way into creating art to varying degrees. I don't care if you're a programmer or an engineer or an artist or a composer. I think that is true no matter what, that there is an inherent creativity, and the fact that we get to do that professionally is absolutely incredible. But even more seminally important to that is the people with whom we share those experiences. And for me, that is always my priority in how I work. It's who I get to work with. And because you will go through difficult times together, you'll go through great times together. And especially if you really lean into getting to know these people, it can really, it can really be the difference between it feeling like a good experience and a horribly taxing one, is that sense of camaraderie and siblinghood, as it were, or family, ishness. That can be achieved. And to me, that's everything. That's the reason why I do it. That's the only reason why you saw here in the studio, I've got a few little sort of tchotchkes that are somehow related to games that I've worked on. And the only reason that I keep those in the studio, since I otherwise really don't want this space to ever feel like a reminder of my past work, is because they were gifts from people who I care about and who made a difference to me, and who I feel very lucky to have worked with, or it's a reminder of that time with them. And to me, that is just everything. And the things I've been lucky enough to do in my career because of that are just wild. A great recent example of a thing that I could never have anticipated is, I remember about 10 years ago also, when Supergiant's first game, Bastion, came out. It was like, wow, this is different. This is unique. I want to know more. Who the hell wrote this music? And it turns out it was this, this hipster record producer from Brooklyn in New York named Darren Korb, who had done it all in a small New York apartment and was literally recording the voiceover of Logan Cunningham in his closet. And they had no budget to do anything. And he had never done a game before. He had no idea what he was doing. And he somehow managed to write this classic. And so I hunted him down and was like, I need to be your friend, because you are unreasonably talented. And we became really close friends, and it always became my tradition at GDC, where he and I would have breakfast and argue about Star Wars. And it turns out he's a massive nerd. And so we became real close. And then, he outdid himself with Transistor. I thought that everything about that was even better than Bastion, and just absolutely incredible. And even though it didn't seem to strike as wide of an audience as the prior two games, their third game, Pyre, he managed to just write some absolutely magnificent music yet again. And we just, maintain this friendship, and we found ways to kind of work together a little bit. I did a game called Tooth and Tail, where I thought it would be fun to feature some covers. Like on the soundtrack album, I would reach out to a few friends to do covers of my score to include on the album, and Darren did a really great one. And then this wonderful thing happened where Supergiant a couple years ago, it was right before the pandemic, so it was actually, I guess, pretty much exactly 2 years ago in PAX in Seattle, whatever that would have been, September maybe of 2019. Supergiant was having its 10th anniversary, and Hades was in early access still, so it wasn't officially released. And to celebrate their 10th anniversary, Darren reached out and said, what if we did a concert together of like kind of some of the greatest hits of Supergiant games? And so he went and picked what he thought was the sort of most popular music that he had written over the last 10 years for the 3 prior games, and including a little taste of music from Hades that he called the Lament of Orpheus. And I produced this concert where we transformed all of these songs that he had done for guitar and drums and bass and himself and Ashley Barrett singing, and we transformed them into these like operatic orchestral pieces. And I conducted the orchestra, and he sang it live, and we did it to this packed house at PAX, and it was like this amazing life-changing experience. And we were sitting there talking to people after the show, and they were asking for autographs and things, and everyone kept asking, where can I hear this again? This was amazing. And I said, yeah, it's a shame, this is it. This is the only, this is the one and done example. Like, this music doesn't exist anywhere except if you were in this room with us while we did it on stage. And so after the concert, called up Darren and I said, what do you think of the idea of us doing an actual studio record of this, of this set, this orchestral reimaginings of the music of Supergiant games? And so he took it to Greg and the other folks at Supergiant and pitched it, and at somewhere in the middle of there, Hades came out on Steam in early access and started exploding. And so it was like, all right, what, let's just do it for real. And so we did. I ended up producing this album and conducting while Darren sang at Abbey Road in London of the best of Supergiant. And then the best part was, because Hades wasn't quite yet finished, I said, surely there's a use of, we can find a way to put some orchestra in Hades somewhere, since the music's not all done yet. And so he was like, spoiler for those of you who haven't finished the game, which I don't blame you. It took me about 5,000 tries to freaking finally get to the end. But he was like, this idea of once you finally beat the final boss, what if this orchestral music is what comes in as like as a contrast and a relief from all the rest? And then there's this song that plays over the ending credits called In the Blood, that can sort of bring it all together and feature the orchestra and the sort of driving, almost borderline metal band, a Greek rock band. And so he invited me to essentially, co-write that music with him. And we did it all at Abbey Road at the same time. And then because of the magic of the scheduling gods, I was able to just stay there and keep recording and include, and then do all the pathless orchestral elements there as well. And then we were able to do it one last time at another PAX, and then literally the pandemic shut the whole world down. And so it's like my last great hurrah in civilization was doing this collaboration with Darren, which is, it's funny because if you were to ask me, what is one of the most special things that you've ever done in your whole career, ironically, one of the first things that I'm going to think of is not even about my music. It was actually about glorifying a friend of mine's music. And that's just the final thing I wanted to mention in terms of it being always about the people. It's always about who you share this time in your life with and who you share your creative energies with. Because doing that album with Darren, literally I'm sitting there in Abbey Road. We're in Studio 2, which is it's literally the room where the Beatles recorded, Pink Floyd recorded. I mean, it is among the most famous and legendary studios on planet Earth. And to be in that room, bringing to life this absolutely magnificent music that Darren has written, and he has made my job harder because he has helped raise the bar of what video game music can be. And I take such pleasure in the idea of the kind of friendly competitiveness that requires, of like, well, shit, now I have to be that much better because freaking Darren just did another hit. God damn it. I relish that. And to be in that room recording that, it's just forever going to be one of the highlights of my entire life. And ultimately, none of that would have happened if not for Journey, but certainly would not have happened, at least I think in my case, if it had not always been about the people, even more than the work itself. So I just always want to make a point of emphasizing that, since we end up talking a bit about music and even a little dabbling into the technical sides of things, but really it's always about our fellow humans. So with that said, I want to hear from you fellow humans. And I know we don't have a huge amount of time left, but I know that I heard a microphone that was parked near the front of the stage earlier during a brief little sound check. So if anybody wants to broaden our conversation here, then hustle to that mic so we don't run out of time. Oh, camera is revealing the mic. All right, I have this very, aha, all right, great.
You are seeing us, oh, that one? Okay, hi.
And that one, yes.
Hello, I am a student currently learning stuff about asset making and art making concept stuff, for games.
Terrific.
And I was just wondering, how close do you typically work with the concept art and asset makers on games and like projects during early development and then later development when stuff is finishing up and tweaks are made?
It's a great question. And it honestly, it really widely depends on the game, because sometimes I'm brought in as early as on like Journey, where I'm there from the start. And what I kind of glossed over, but I didn't mention was that Matt Nava was creating all this concept art in the early days of Journey. And as you probably know about the way game design often works, it takes a while for there to be any kind of playable prototype, because there's just so much initial legwork that has to happen before there's anything that can really exist tangibly. So the concept art ends up being one of the main things that I can look at in those early days to have something to kind of react to and to try to write music inspired by. But other times I'm brought in where they've already made it past that initial process of prototyping and gray boxing and whatever. So by the time I'm involved, I always try to avoid this. I try to be in there as early as possible. But there are times where the artist has kind of, especially concept artists, has sort of made their mark already. And now it's really about the build of the game and the actual in-game assets. And that's what I would be responding to and interacting with. But as a general answer, I always try to interact with everyone on the team. I love talking to the programmers. I love talking, of course, I'm in constant dialogue with the sound designers and anybody that's creating audio assets. Of course, we work very closely together, but concept art, gameplay designers, I love having meetings with the people who are, like the writers, like on Giant Squids on the Pathless. They hired a guy named Steve Lerner to be the writer. And I remember having long chats with him, just talking about the lore of the world that he was writing, because that somehow helps me too. So yeah, to me, there's no one I don't like to collaborate with. And if you're on a team, I always say, do your best to get to know everybody else on that team, including the so-called outsourced, freelance contractors like music. If you have a chance to interact with those people, you can never predict what sparks might fly. Maybe nothing, but maybe something that none of you could have predicted. And so, yeah, always worth doing.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the talk and thanks for Play, Watch, Listen. It's always a joy.
Thank you. I have to record a new one in like an hour.
Great. I'm wondering about creating diegetic music for games.
Yeah.
How I feel it's underused, but I guess it's very hard. So I'm wondering if what's your experience with that, and how does it differ from creating other kinds of music in your games?
Actually, in my experience, it's diegetic. So for those unaware, diegetic music, being part of the diegesis refers to being part of the internal world of the characters. So a diegetic piece of music would be one that the characters on screen can also hear. So like music on a radio, or if there's someone in the corner playing guitar, all of that counts as diegetic music. And sometimes it's original music. Like if you think of, Dragon Age, where they're in like the tavern and the person's playing and singing like a ballad, or it can be, GTA, where it's a licensed piece of music that you turn on the radio and it's just playing, but it's like real music that you could know from the outside world, like from our world. All of that would count as diegetic music. And I've written that a handful of times. Probably my favorite example of which was on Assassin's Creed Syndicate, where they asked me to write a series of songs that would be played in the bars and on the streets after you killed one of the major targets, this genre, this 19th century genre called a murder ballad, would play, where, you know, after you take down, you know, like what's a good example, like Maxwell Roth, the theater impresario, which I believe is mission 8 of the 9 narrative missions. You know, culminates in a giant burning opera house where you have to kill him and then escape. You know, if you go and listen in the world afterward, there's like some anonymous composer in 1860s London has apparently now written a song about the untimely death of Maxwell Roth that we call Jokes, Jokes, Jokes. And so it's actually, in a way, diegetic music is considerably easier because it plays back like a track. Like if it's somebody, like another example on Assassin's Creed Syndicate was the side missions where you can go to just kind of level up your character and do these fight clubs, like this sort of underground brawling sort of, you know, secret society of fighting. And they did motion capture of an Irish Bowron player, which is like a drum, a sort of traditional Irish drum, and a guitarist and a violinist playing like folk music they literally did motion capture of musicians playing, that they made in-game characters of these 3 musicians sort of like gigging live while these people beat the shit out of each other in this ring. So they told me, those are the 3 instruments that you can write for, and we can animate, like we can create a metronome that will animate their movements to a specific tempo to match what you write. So, you know, and I had a range that I had to adhere to. I couldn't write something like wildly fast or slow, but we could, you know, they could flexibly turn it up and down a little. So then I just wrote like some like, you know, some kind of quasi Celtic fight music that are like accompanying literal, and it's purely diegetic. But I say it's sort of easier because it's one of those where it's not, in my experience, diegetic music is almost never actually interactive to the player, because that would sort of break its diegetic nature unless it was the kind of thing where it's creating a gameplay scenario where they're actually responding to you. Like if it was a jazz band where you could, you know, like if it was a game where you could say, hey, you know, play faster, and you could like request something of the band and they actually reply, then we would have to design a system, obviously, which would be really fun. I've never done that. But this is different. Now, that said, something that I'm working on right now that I actually can talk about, I'm working on an interactive, a video game musical that is, so all the I'm writing just piles and piles of songs. There's like well over 4 hours of songs in this game, and it's all interactive. So it works kind of like the lead writer is David Gator, who was the writer of the Dragon Age series, and so it has a dialogue tree style like BioWare mechanic, but it's the songs where you're changing. It's not just changing the lyrics of the song, but they're changing the storyline. Like our rule is every important narrative decision in the game must happen during a song. It cannot happen during dialogue. So you make massive changes that influence the trajectory of the characters and of the world and the story, and who lives, who dies, all that kind of thing. And in typical BioWare fashion, you know, romanceable subplots and all that kind of thing is all happening through song, which means that it is diegetic. The characters can hear it, but it's also a musical, which is kind of cheating because musicals behave by their own set of rules. So yeah, traditionally in my mind, the closest thing I ever do to just writing tracks is actually those rare instances of diegetic music, but it's actually been fairly rare overall, since the majority of what I do is writing a score, which we would call non-diegetic music, meaning we, the player or the audience, can hear it, but the character themselves obviously cannot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So there seem to be 2 more questions, but we are running quite late, so we might need to get through those quite swiftly. And I need to know more about this musical game series. He sounds fantastic. But yeah, we'll maybe talk about that later.
No, I can't wait to unleash it. We still have quite a bit of work to do, but it's really fun. I mean, we're throwing everything we can at it. Laura Bailey is our sort of lead actor, and Troy Baker is directing, and it's just like, it's been the most fun, and we still have a lot to do. But anyway, I'll lightning round these questions, I promise.
Big fan of the video you made with Scruffy on adaptive audio and
Oh,
stuff.
wow.
I was
thank you.
wondering what the biggest challenges and benefits are of including or implementing adaptive audio in games, whether that be through music or more environmental sounds.
It's a great question. It's a little tricky to answer quickly, but I can summarize by saying that music is one of those art forms that is distinct from painting, distinct from writing, distinct from, you know, sculpture. The majority of art forms, music is one of those that the consumption of which is married to the linear passage of time. We cannot experience music in a sort of timeless way, the way that we can experience a painting, for example. Music is all about this begets this begets this. It's ephemeral. It takes place over the linear passage of time. Interactive music says, what if that linear passage of time is itself this complex web of branching narratives such that our perception of it is linear because we are human beings living in this world with this non-Denis Villeneuve arrival-esque non-linear passage of time. And so as a result, how do we make the non-linear feel linear, which means that it's not this succession of, I'm playing BioShock and I'm wandering around and it's giving me nice, creepy explorational music. And then I fire my gun at somebody and it does this aggressive, hard interruption and just says, aha, combat music. It's like, that doesn't feel, if you went to a concert, they wouldn't do that. If you watched a movie, they wouldn't do that. If you sat down to play the piano, you wouldn't do that, most likely. It doesn't feel linear. It doesn't feel like, ooh, setup, payoff, tension, release, all the things that make music great. So it's a fundamental challenge. Non-linear music is basically saying the single most important characteristic of music, which is the linear passage of time, is now this variable that we can play with the same way that we play with rhythm, harmony, melody, texture, all those other things. And so we're kind of trying to make music something it doesn't naturally want to be, but that's what's so exciting to me about it. And that's why I love it. It's also why it's such an outrageous challenge.
Thank you.
All right, grand finale. Thank you all for sticking around. I know we're running over and it's 8:30 in the morning for me. So I've got like sunrise and birds chirping and all beautiful unicorns and rainbows. And you guys are probably feeling the evening settling in and getting lethargic. So thank you for sticking around.
Okay, so on the topic of like using music theory when composing or versus just vibing on the piano and such, do you use one over the other, or is it just whatever happens in the moment?
I really wouldn't say that I kind of I'm really not either of those things. To me, music theory is a post hoc and analytical tool. It's not a guide for writing music. It's not a recipe book. It's a way to understand how things work. And I'm a nerd for theory. I always enjoyed studying theory, but I can't say the only time that theory has ever actually informed my writing is if I'm trying to achieve something extremely specific, and usually it would mean like if I need something to sound authentically, Mozart-esque or Beethoven-esque or Schubert-esque or Mendelssohn-esque or whatever, you can analyze through a lens of music theory how they worked, what things that they did differently from each other, what makes Mendelssohn different from Schubert or whatever. And theory is a useful tool for that, but I definitely don't consider it a prescription of anything, because theory is literally just the way that you describe something that's finished and you try to wrap your brain around it. And obviously the more complex that music has gotten over the centuries, like the Western classical tradition, at least specifically, the theoretical frameworks are increasingly less valuable because the vocabulary has widened so much. And so, yeah, I think to me, it sort of scratches my nerd itch, but it is a not particularly useful tool for writing outside of a few very narrow circumstances. But I wouldn't say that I also just sit down and sort of absent-mindedly vibe either. It's always about asking myself these questions. Okay, I want to, like Journey, what do I want to achieve? What's the goal? The goal is a solemnity, an introspection, something that feels very meditative, also very emotional and expressive and beautiful, but through the filter of kind of like loneliness. Well, somehow to me that adds up to a solo cello. That's how I can try to summarize all of that. So it's not like I just sort of randomly put my hands on the piano and started playing. I thought, how can I answer this question? And my answer, it's subjective. Someone might have a different answer, but my answer was that. So I wouldn't call it arbitrary. It was purposeful, but it wasn't also, it needs to be B minor because of the way that the circle of fifths relates B minor to the sort of natural acoustical physics of the open strings of a cello, or anything theoretical or analytic like that. If that
Thank you.
Hopefully made sense.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave that there as the last question, but Austin, thank you so much for getting up early to call in. And I think even though it's been an online session, it's just been amazing. It's given us an opportunity to have a look inside your studio, inside your head, and it's been absolutely fantastic. And hopefully you might be able to join us next year in person, but we'll definitely
I am hell-bent.
Invitation again. So
I was sure this year would be the year we finally make this happen. I'm so grateful that collectively the organizers of Konsoll haven't given up on me. That we've had to sort of kick it down the road each year, and at least this way it worked. So yeah, no, thank you. It's always I need to give you a hug again. I'm running a massive deficit, and likewise to our other friends there. But no, thank you. It is a real pleasure always.
We'll definitely make it happen in the near future. And thank you so much for a fantastic end session for today. Thank you, Austin.
Thank you.